He and the police were agreed on this. But ever since the hoarding had commenced, the house had been kept locked, and it was Mr. Lancaster's custom to make the rounds 2 or 3 times a day, examining all doors and windows. The cellar windows were also protected by iron bars, and the door to it was padlocked. All other windows and doors were found to be locked, and although by inside collusion this might have been arranged, careful investigation of the servants drew a complete blank. Two of them were quiet and respectable women who during the entire investigation were carefully watched without result. Peggy McMullen, or Peggy Holmes, was young and pretty, but she had been on the back porch, carefully dressed and made up for her afternoon out, when the alarm was raised. The family then came under consideration. Unnatural crimes are not new to the police, and the overturned flower pot, the bits of grass on the porch roof and the raised screen looked like something prearranged to show escape by the roof. But in the family the police included Jim Wellington. His presence in the house, his later admission that he had been in the room, his own production of clothing stained with the dead woman's blood, and the final argument that he stood to win by her will were certainly all suspicious. Added to this was the fact that a substitution had been effected for the gold in the chest. There was not one of them, on the morning the chest was opened, who did not believe that whether Jim had killed his aunt or not he had certainly systematically robbed her, and there is not a doubt in the world that had they found that old glove of his which Margaret had smuggled to me on Thursday night, he would have been arrested and later on indicted for the murder. But intensive search of his house and of the Grapevine Path, as well as all open ground in the neighborhood, produced no gloves. They had even, all this was news to me, examined the ashes of Daniel's fire in No Man's Land, but all they found were a few buttons from an old suit of overalls, and one of these went back to headquarters, but was ignored there. The search, however, included more than the gloves. Miss Emily's wild excitement over the missing key and chain from her mother's neck puzzled them, and in fact it is still not quite clear to Herbert, or to any of them, just why it was found where it was. You can see why Emily was worried about it, he says. If she could find it and hide it, it might mean a delay in the discovery that the chest had been looted. On the other hand, the taking of the key and chain may have been a clever move on Lydia's part to prevent the opening of the chest until she had managed to get away with Emily's trunk. I imagine that's the real answer, but things got too hot for her. She buried it where it was found later on, and I've wondered since whether Lizzie Cromwell didn't see her do it. Something made Lizzie suspect her even before the night Emily was killed. That's certain. Before I leave the keys and get back to the first murder, I should explain here that Herbert is confident that Emily had a second key to the chest, since she could not have used the one her mother wore around her neck. And I fancy that there is where Holmes first came into the case, he says. He was handy with tools, and either she gave him a tracing of the key she wanted and had him make her one, or she asked him to get one from a locksmith. That would have been in the spring, but Holmes was shrewd. He knew through Peggy that the gold was in the house, and he knew of that room she had taken at the McMullins. When he learned that the money was missing, all he had to do was to figure how it had been taken out, so he made his book into a box and, well, it killed him. The district attorney that first night was unwilling to hold Jim. He had made a good witness. Also, he was well and favorably known, and the police could not afford to make any mistake. But also Mr. Sullivan, who had had more than one axe murder in his experience, had examined those clothes of Jim's, and he maintained that the stains on them were not the stains which would have come as the axe was lifted for one blow after another. They looked, according to the detective, to be exactly what Jim had said they were. If he had raised the axe, there would have been drops on his coat and shirt. There were none there. In the end they let him go, but he was under careful surveillance from that time on. Up to that point Herbert and the police were in agreement. But now they split. They had made two divisions, he explains. The people in the house and someone outside. I made three, for I included the visitors that day, Jim himself, Mrs. Talbot and Lydia, and it was at the inquest on Saturday that I got a bit of light. Lydia Talbot had been admitted by the front door with her basket for Mrs. Lancaster, had later taken the basket to the rear of the house and gone out by the kitchen door. Natural enough, probably, but if you are up against a locked house where no one could get in but someone apparently had, you have to begin somewhere. And I didn't like her. She was a neurotic. It was in that flat voice of hers, was written all over her. What he wondered that day was just what Lydia had done after she left Mrs. Lancaster's room and before she appeared down the back stairs to the kitchen porch to leave her basket and its contents. What she could have done, if conditions were right, was obvious enough. She could have slipped down the front stairs, unlocked the front door, gone back up to where she had left the basket and taken it down to the kitchen porch. She had 2 witnesses there to prove that she had left the house. Then, under cover of all that shrubbery, all she had to do was to circle the house, going by the empty laundry wing, and enter it again by the front door, locking it behind her. It was only a possibility at first. He knew nothing of the crescent, or of its interrelationships. There seemed no object in her killing her sister-in-law. They might have quarreled, of course. There was Emily on the stand saying she had left Lydia with her mother while she cleaned her bird's cage. But the presence of the axe was the rock on which he almost foundered. Grant a quarrel or anything you like, she had carried no axe in a 10-inch basket, although we know now that she carried some other things besides food. A ball of cord, for instance, and a knife or a pair of scissors. And that axe had to be taken into the house somehow. By the Sunday morning after the first murder, however, he had veered to the idea that it was an inside job after all. He had got us all straightened out in his mind by that time, and he had had my story of the glove. He was still working on his own, and I have already told how I got him into the Lancaster house. What he wanted was the second glove, or some proof that it had been destroyed.